All right, so now that we got our decimation out of here, we're ready to start the retopology process. So retopology is where we rebuild the wireframe for the character. And generally this process is going to be to create the low poly that we're eventually going to turn into the game mesh. Now, remember at the start of this, I talked about the process of creating a low poly for the purpose of baking and texturing that then gets converted into the game mesh. And that is where we are at. But before we get there, I want to talk about some of the different pathways that game topology takes in particular. So when we talk about games, there's a lot of different approaches that you can take. And there's a very important thing to understand with games, which is this concept called draw calls. Now, a draw call is when the computer or machine or console, whatever is playing it, needs to actually create something on the screen. It's going to trigger a draw call. And a single object can have multiple draw calls. So these tend to be the biggest area of optimization in terms of poor game performance. And making the decision for the draw call kind of starts here. So, for example, when we think about an individual object, basically one mesh is going to equate to a single draw call. Now, in addition to that, this is also going to tie into one material because materials attached to meshes. And with something like a character like this, we can end up with multiple meshes, multiple materials, depending on how they go. There's other factors, too, in terms of calculations of optimization. For example, the vertex number, the number of actually verts we have on an object. And the other thing to think about is like vertex edges, which is edges that transition to other vertices and cuts in terms of your UVs. So when it comes to doing a character retopology, sometimes we will combine the separate meshes. So for example, right now, if we take a look at our character, the hands, for example, are separate than the arms, are separate from the torso, is separate from the belt, is separate from the buckle. And this is often how we do modeling for something like film for high-end stuff. But when it comes to our game mesh in terms of retopology, there's a very good chance that the wireframe from the hands is going to flow into the wireframe for the arm, is going to flow into the wireframe for the body, and the body's wireframe isn't just going to be the body, it's going to include the belt, it's going to include the buckle, and this is all going to be basically one mesh going over the top. And what's going to distinguish between belt and body, or buckle and body, or glove and arm is actually the textures. It's going to be the normal map and the colors. And what this allows us to do is create a substantially more optimized character where all of these things are continuous and part of a singular mesh, sharing a vertice cluster that's continuous as opposed to being separated. Now, this is ideal for RPG games where you have a lot of elements on screen, and in particular, low-end and mobile games. Now, I am creating this video in the year 2025. This could change in the future, depending on where mobile devices go. If mobile devices start to incorporate graphics technology and have dedicated graphics cards, then there's a good chance that we're not going to worry about this quite as much. But I do feel like for a very long time, this is going to be practical. There's also a lot of other advantages to this. Now, I want to show you a character that kind of uses this approach so you can understand it. And I'll go ahead and show you one of the ones I did for Kingdom Maker. This Frost Giant character is for a mobile game. And to give you an idea, when we look at the wireframe, notice how the beard is incorporated into the body, and the belt buckle is incorporated into the body, so on and so forth. And we can see that down here in the wireframe breakdown a little bit more clearly if we go ahead and take a look at this. The beard is actually part of the body. A great example is this area here. You can see these aren't all separate pieces. These are actually combined with the arm wireframe. Likewise, this pelt here is actually combined with the loincloth. You can't really see it very well because it's been done properly. But if you look at it here, you can kind of see how those wireframes are interconnecting, and the vertices are actually part of the same cluster. They're actually welded onto that surface. And a good spot I can point out here is kind of the transition of the torso and the arm. You can see this area here where the texture is. There's a distinct little ledge of where the arm and that area share the same space. So through various things like texture maps, we can essentially create the illusion of this object having these separate chunks, but be one continuous mesh is what I'm getting at. Now, there are some exceptions. For example, the shoulders are their own floating piece, but even everything up in here to the head and the helmet, these are all combined a single mesh with no separate pieces. So this is a very common way to approach characters inside of video games, especially for the RPG genre, and it's the way they have been done for many years. Now, the alternative is separate pieces, where you would have something like a separate helmet mesh, you would have separate glove mesh, separate leg, separate body, and this depends on the need of the game, but when you have something like gear swaps, this becomes practical. When it's actually something you're going to have built into the game, things that can change. So for example, on this character, it might even be something like the weapon. Maybe our character never changes, but our weapon does, so maybe we need to keep that separate. But if the character and the weapon are never going to change, we can actually combine those into each other when it comes to rigging, and we'll talk about that when we get there. Now, like I mentioned, this is going to be very common for things like film. Some higher-end video games make use of this. I've worked on various things like avatar systems, even for mobile games that make use of this. It depends on the budget of the game in terms of, what kind of polygons they can put on screen, how the world's going to be built. An example would be something like this Spartan character. This is not built for video games. This is a high-end subdivision character that I made, but I can show you what I mean here in terms of the difference. If we take a look at him, all of his pieces are separate. So his helmet here is separate. It's not like this guy where it's actually, attached into the head mesh. This guy's helmet can't come off, for example. The sword, the sheath, the belt, these are all separate pieces. They're individual pieces that can come apart. They can be in different places. This guy's belt is built in. You literally can't take his belt off. And we might be able to see that here in terms of the wireframe. You can see how it's connecting right into the torso. We'd want those to align that way anyway, but you can actually see how it's continuous and part of that, and not separate. Weapons and shield, it's pretty standard for these to be separate. Even his little harness, something like this harness, you absolutely would include in a texture map on a game character that's, going to be relatively low end because it's pretty much skin tight. And then, of course, his cape is also separate. But, looking at the wireframes, you can see that the character even has sort of a nude mesh underneath. So if you're working on a game where you can swap out gear, this is the kind of thing you're going to have. It's kind of like a base underneath and then individual clothing on top. So there's essentially two approaches you can take. Now, the approach we're going to take is going to be more like this guy here. The reason why I want to take this approach is the other approach we've already done. The way we modeled this guy in separate chunks, that's already a great example of what you would expect. The main difference is how you're going to organize atlases. Maybe you do it by piece, maybe you do it by gear set. There's some differences there. But I want to show you guys how to get to this process here, because this is a bit more complicated, a bit more challenging, and substantially more practical since a large portion of the market is in mobile games as of the time I am making this. All right, so we're going to treat this from the perspective of something like a mobile app. I'm going to do kind of an in-between in terms of resolution. I might make it a little bit higher than I would for mobile, but we should be able to reduce it down. Okay, so now that we've talked about that, what I want to talk about is setting this up to be easy to retopologize and give us a nice practical surface. So we're going to prep that for this process. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hero decimated here, and I'm actually going to Control D to duplicate this, and I'm going to turn off the visibility of the other one. Now, I have it attached to this hero high layer, which I'm actually okay with. I could either toggle the visibility here or hit Control H. In this case, I'm going to take my duplicate, right-click to remove it from this layer, because when we duplicate it, it's there, and just turn off the source. So now this one should be turned off, and this one should be fine. And for this one, I'll just make this my hero retopo base, even though I'm going to have to reorganize all this stuff. And what we're going to do now is we're actually going to utilize some booleans to combine things. The reason why is when you're working with the quad draw inside of Maya, it really likes to jump between overlapping surfaces. So certain areas like the torso here, for example, or the gloves and the arm, there's probably a portion of this that's intersecting. And you can see that there. What I'll do is I'll just select doesn't really matter which one, the arm or the torso. And if you perform a mesh Boolean operation and do a union, this will combine these, and more importantly, what it will do is it will make it so that the overlapping area is deleted. And what we're going to want to do is just repeat this process for the entire torso. And the purpose of this is to make it a little bit easier to make that continuous retopology across the surface, so that Maya is not constantly trying to jump between the top part and the bottom part. Now, once again, I'm working with 2026 here. This is my first look at the software. I don't know if there's going to be some errors. They did make some adjustments to Booleans, so hopefully we're not going to run into any issues here. But yeah, it might take a bit to Boolean these because of how high poly they are. I do also want to mention the step isn't necessary. It's just kind of convenient to have to speed up the retopology workflow. Now, after each of these, I am going to delete the history on this because we just don't need it. I prefer to use Booleans how they used to be used. And you'll see now there's no gap there between that and the glove. And that's going to make it a little bit easier for us to make a continuous mesh between these. So I'm just going to repeat this process now, going through each of these to combine the necessary pieces that I want to be part of the entire cluster. So for example, here, we can go ahead and union these, combine these. And, you know, I do want to mention, why did I keep the high poly? This is going to compromise some of the detail when we do these Booleans in terms of how it deletes. It's, you know, not going to give us as clean of a result. So the high level decimation with the individual parts, the purpose of that is for the bake mesh when we go over to Substance Painter. We're going to be using that. Now, I do like to do my prep on them in Maya because there's some things we can do that make our life a lot easier over there, such as creating ID maps and using a explode bake of high to low if you do have separate pieces. And sometimes we do retopologize this with the intent of combining it with the whole, but we separate it out for a cleaner bake. So we'll explore that as we go. This character is a great prime target for that. So the reason why that one exists is for that reason. The other reason is there is a chance with some of these things here, we may want to break out and retopologize a portion without the whole in the way, if that makes sense. So we still might bounce over to our high poly and be like, you know what? I don't really want the body to be in the way of me doing the glove. Let's just use the glove here. And then we can have options to toggle through either a whole or a non-whole. You could also do this in ZBrush before exporting. You could do a Dynamesh and then you could decimate. So you don't necessarily have to do this in Maya. I tend to do it in Maya just out of habit. But you'll see those are all now interconnected, so no holes. And then we'll go ahead and work our way down here. I'm going to bring these two together. You can decide how you want to do this. I think I'm going to do belt to body and then buckle to the rest. And just kind of keep unionizing these. Now, what's kind of funny is this is very likely the opposite of decimation mesh. As we start to add more of these together, it's going to take longer because there's more polygons to calculate. But just be patient with the process. And if you do skip this process for whatever reason, you'll probably notice the reason I did it. It can be a bit frustrating dealing with the Make Life tool and Quad Draw going across some of these pieces. As a heads up, I am going to be speeding through these, so what you guys see is not nearly as long as this is actually going to take. All right, so that gets our torso in here. When you're using Maya for this, just make sure you're actually selecting the combined Boolean. It likes to spit out basically individual meshes. I'm not a big fan of how they changed the Boolean tool in here. It didn't used to be this way for all you younglings out there. You used to press Union and it just combined the two. The new system, it's much more robust and it does open up some cool stuff for animation. But when it comes to just strict modeling, sometimes I wish they had maybe made a legacy set. And maybe they do have it and I just haven't found it. But it would be nice if sometimes the functionality of how things used to be was preserved. All right, so that gets our belt buckle in here. And at this point, we have the bulk of this kind of in. Maya does have a tendency to make this crash, so I am just going to save, and I haven't made any alterations to this that are going to be detrimental, so I'm not going to break this out as a separate piece. But this will give me a nice chunk for the torso. I'm going to work my way up to the head and neck area now to get that attached into here. And then I need to make some decisions on the pants, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So we can select these two, do another mesh boolean to unionize those. All right, so we got the head in here. So the other parts are a little bit different. The shoulders I'm going to leave separate because those don't need to be combined. And when it comes to the helmet's kind of an interesting area because I don't necessarily need it to have a gap between the head. But this area here, I do need to kind of maintain a gap with. And if you look at how the helmet relates to the body, we're going to have a relatively hard time keeping those separate. So I might keep that separate for now with the mentality that I'll boolean together later. And the main reason is having the head separate here is going to make it a lot easier to tie into the body. What I will do, though, is take the horns here and boolean these to the helmet. All right, so that takes care of that. Always make sure you delete the history if you're doing this process, though. Otherwise, it's going to come back and haunt you. And now we can go ahead and come down here and start doing the legs and the boots and maybe the kneecaps. So taking a look at these, we can definitely combine the boots in with these. We can combine the boots here, so we can select these two and do a mesh boolean and do a union. Now, the kneecaps are kind of an interesting one because they almost have this sort of floating sense in this design. They're not really incorporated correctly, I guess you could say, into the design. So this is something that I might need to play around with to see if I could make this work for our needs. These could potentially be fine separate and floating, without combining them in. It's going to give you a few extra vertices, but also on the backside of these, we can just kind of poke to a triangle, which may actually end up saving us vertices as opposed to having it tied into the main torso. So the kneecaps are also an area I think I might keep separate here, but as far as the boots and the legs go there, those can definitely go in. And yeah, with these, I think we'll keep them separate for now. I don't necessarily think those will combine that great into there. Now, the other thing, too, is the torso and the pants. We can possibly keep these separate without tying them in together. It might be okay to tie them in together. It just kind of depends on, how close these are and whether or not it's going to give us the right deformation on the legs. To make things simpler for the deformation of the legs, I think I'll keep this a separate chunk and that a separate chunk, and these individual pieces for now. So this will go ahead and prep our character here for the retopology process. We have our shoulders, knees, torso. You might want to do some naming on these to make your life a little bit easier. So I'll just make this knees D for divided or decimated. Shoulders D. And come into here. This will be our torso D. Helm D. And you can use whatever name convention works for you. This will be our legs D. All right, so let me go ahead and put those into here. I'm just going to highlight these, delete their history, and then we can start building the game mesh on top of this with retopology. All right, so let's go ahead and start with the retopology process now. And with something like this, it's like, where do we begin? There's a lot of stuff going on here. So it does kind of depend. Generally with characters, I like to start with the head. Then I work over to important areas like the hands, the feet, and then I kind of connect inward towards the body. But it also depends on the character. With something like this, we don't have all that happening. So we can kind of do it in piecemeal. Now, what I might do is start with the helmet here, and I'll isolate this to make things a little bit easier. In particular, we're going to start with the outside. And I'll select this here, and the way we retopologize in Maya is we use the Make Live tool on our high poly here. That way we can draw over the top. And then we come over here to our modeling toolkit, and we access Quad Draw. Quad Draw is located down here, and it allows us to draw quads right on the surface. We also want to make sure we have symmetry turned on. You can either use object or world. Generally speaking, world is the safer one here since we're not really mapping to a particular object. We're building a new one. And with Quad Draw active, what we can do is we can place vertices. So let me just go through it for those of you who haven't seen it by clicking. And if we place 4 of these, we can hold Shift and we can create a quad. You can still move the vertices around. And if you want another quad, you can just place 2 more vertices and hold Shift and connect. That will make a new one. You could also hold Tab to pull out to create a new one. You can combine 2 by just dragging the vertice over another vertice, and that will weld. you can hold down Control to add in an edge. And if you hold down Control and Shift, Control Shift will allow you to delete. So you can delete an edge, you can delete a face. And this also creates geometry you can see down here. So you can still use any of Maya's tools with this. You could also hit delete. So that's kind of the basics here. If you guys want to know more about the Quadro tool and retopology and just kind of a more robust introduction, I suggest checking out my anatomy course on Udemy. We go through the process of building an entire human base mesh, doing an anatomy study, and then I also take you through the process of doing a base retopology, UV layout, texture projection. If anything else comes up as we go through this, I'll mention it, but that's kind of the basics there. So what I'm going to do with Quadro here is I'm going to just start by trying to get the big pieces in here. And when we're doing a game mesh, what we want to think about is kind of the silhouette, where we're going to need more edges, where we're going to need less. And don't be afraid to use triangles as well, all right? So for example here, I'm probably going to need to have at least, 2 edges here. But in this corner area here, I'm not sure if that's necessarily true. But what I might do is move this down here to utilize these for that area. And I'll do the same at the top here. I'm pretty sure this is also going to require at least 2 or 3 edges to get this to look decent in this area. And I think this one's actually going to be 3, which is okay. Generally, our head area is going to be the most dense anyway, so with something like a helmet here, that's also going to probably remain true. And as far as these bevel edges go, we're going to get that through the normal map, so I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to give this one 3 as well. It seems like a safe number, just looking at how that curve's going. And to kind of complete things, I'm just going to drag this down here. Now, remember, this is a process video, so I'm not going too detailed into the tools and how I'm using them. So just be aware of that for those of you who are just joining us. You can use whatever retopology tools you want, and you can always look up these tools specifically. I may even have a tutorial on some of these since I use them so often. So I'm just going to kind of work these curved areas to begin with. Now, I fully anticipate these giving us some grief when it comes to the baking process. So we'll probably be revisiting this when we get to the bake. We'll see. But I'm going to pull these down to where the head's at, and eventually we're going to tie the head in there. So I'm not going to necessarily add in detail to the backside of this. As far as this front curve goes, I just want to give it enough to kind of convey the information. So I'm going to be kind of pulling these back and down here. And when we're developing a game mesh, we really want to think about how the bake's going to go and what information we need versus what we don't. You want the bake to do a decent amount of work for you. So a lot of video game meshes can actually be pretty low poly, and that's kind of the whole point of the real-time approach, is it does give us the ability to kind of have low poly meshes using the various techniques we implement. Now, as I get towards the center point here, I have an area that is mandatory. That ledge I have to keep no matter what. So I'm just going to readjust these down the road here and just look for kind of even spacing where possible. This area here needs a little bit more volume from the looks of it, so I'll go ahead and add that in. This doesn't necessarily mean we need to keep this in quads. We could come in here and just weld these to be triangles. So, for example, I don't necessarily need this edge down here. And that's something to look for when you're doing your game meshes is, does this edge contribute substantially, or is it not necessarily needed? And I'm just going to kind of nudge these to be on the bevel line. So they're kind of transitioning slopes. That way I'm not getting 90-degree angles. And that's going to help with us when we go to do the bake. Now we do have a line of symmetry that I'm going to pull this in here for, and we'll continue down. But we're going to have to solve for that area in a moment here. So before we do, I'm just going to work my way around here and finish off some of these areas that are in the more complicated curve zone of the helmet, since I am kind of anticipating this being the problem area. And I can add, other transitions down here. In this particular case, this will give me an idea of the direction these need to flow. And then we can add in edges as needed here. So this is another one of those areas where I think 3 edges is going to be good to have. And even though I'm doing 3 edges here now, this might be something I change in the game mesh. So I'm doing these 3 edges for the sake of projection, which is important to understand. When we do our baking, that's the projection I'm talking about. And as with most things in 3D, the more vertices you have, the better. However, we need this to be somewhere between, amazing and dense and the perfect geometry for this projection, but also being the perfect geometry to reduce to turn into a actual game mesh. So this mesh is kind of going to be walking the line here in between those. The retopology process does take a while, and you might be wondering, is there some way to automate this? And depending when you're watching this, the answer is going to be yes or no. There are automatic tools for retopology, but they lead to suboptimal meshes. And if you're looking for quick shortcuts, that's great. If you're doing your own work, it's not great if you're actually working on a team that relies on you. I have found over the years it is very rare that you will get a good optimized mesh from any of the automated solutions out there. And for those of you who are wondering about AI, AI so far has been atrocious for vertices. Now, I'm recording this at the start of 2025. So it's like May 2025. That could change rapidly, okay? So just so this doesn't age like sour milk, there's a good chance that automatic retopology could become, a very proficient thing in the future. As of right now, though, it's one of the areas that I would say is suffering, and it's one of those areas that has kind of always been suffering. All right, so something like that's going to give us a good kind of base to go off of here. I'm going to continue this one down here and just take a similar approach to connecting this down and connecting this across to finish this. And you'll see how I'm working with these big broad shapes. What I want to do is get the structural information in first and then come back in later to concern myself with any functionality that this needs to have. And I'll go ahead and give this one multiple as well. I don't think it's necessary, though, on this one. I actually think the silhouette will read better if I don't have that. But I'll add it in because I feel like it is going to be needed for areas like this. And it could always be the case that on the inside here I make it curved, on the outside I don't. So that's something that, could change later. And I'll also add a supporting edge here to kind of help hold the volume, though I also don't necessarily feel we need that. But adding it now will help us down the road, and this will give us kind of a good start to the helmet base here. So there we go. What I'm going to do now is take a look at this, in terms of a core functionality, getting this to go back. So this is an area that's kind of interesting because we have a lifted area going into a non-lifted area. So this here is going to have a ledge, and it's going to kind of connect into this ledge here. I have a little bit of an angle here, so I have to decide how I want to do this. And in terms of this, I basically want that to be taking up this whole area. So what I can do here is actually bring this in here, like so. And you'll see how I'm making a little angle here with that edge. What that will allow me to do is kind of wedge in another quad here that I can weld. And you'll see how it just created the support structure for that area. I can then use this to pull out the side here, like so, and then we can connect the cross here, keeping this all one continuous mesh. It's very similar to how our high poly was, but a little bit more simplified here. And we could even go to the extent of doing that, where we connect that in and use a triangle. Nothing wrong with that. That's actually going to be kind of ideal here for what we're doing. So this is going to lay the foundations for our helmet here. At this point, it's kind of a matter of kind of connecting things back. But there is the matter of the horn here. So the horn is an area that we are going to potentially want to connect into the helmet if we're going to make this continuous. There's really no point in having it be separate. I'm going to save my progress real quick. Now that we have some, I'm just going to set this to Retopology 02, and then we'll start in on that horn. So committing to the horn is going to be one of those harder areas. How I like to start any sort of round piece is with a sort of radial setup here. So you can think of it as a cube. You can start with a cube, and then basically connect the lines downward, like so. And this is probably going to look awful to begin with, but it's going to give you the base that we want to have in terms of this. So something like that, is going to represent our horn and the lowest poly abstraction. And there actually is a good chance that one of our LOD meshes will make use of this. And I can proceed to continue down the horn here, filling this in, and continuing to the base. This is not the final density we're going to settle with. I do want to emphasize that. But the reason I like to do this is it's easier to control, and it's easier to kind of see the midpoint there. What's really nice about QuadDraw and Maya is we can always retroactively come in here and add geometry. And not just that, we still have access to the entire suite of Maya tools. So we can do, smooth mesh preview conversions and all sorts of other things. Now, I may stop when I get to this area here where we have this lip. I have to decide if that warrants geometry or not. Depending on the size of your character, you might actually just capture that in the normal map. But this is going to give me an idea of how much roundness this is going to take, which is going to determine the number of edges we use. So the center point acts as kind of our division plane. I can divide down the center here and divide down the center here by adding an edge, and you'll see that's going to add volume in. Now, this is going to give us a certain amount of sides. If you think about what we had, we started with 4, and then we split that twice. And we can decide if this is going to give us enough roundness. Now, it's never a bad idea to count the faces if you don't know how many you have. Remember, there's that rule of 12 I mentioned. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is going to be 8 total. So this might be enough, but, since it's on the helmet here, it's high up, I might consider coming in here and adding another series of divisions down either side to help us out with this in terms of density. So something like that might give us a bit more detail here. The one challenge, though, is we do need to be aware of the density we're getting. Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 of these. So we could potentially reduce this by 2 somewhere. But, for the sake of keeping things even, I'm going to leave that be for now. With the QuadDraw, you can also hold down Shift, and this will give you the ability to smooth. So we can hold Shift here and basically smooth this out. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll actually just pipe in a whole bunch of density into the upper area and reduce that down later. So, for example, this isn't very practical here for like a game mesh, coming in here and adding all these edges. But for the sake of coming in and smoothing this, it makes it so that they evenly disperse a little bit nicer and give us what we're looking for. I can also take some time to kind of adjust the midpoint here, since I do know I'm going to want to keep that and kind of bring it across. But that will go ahead and, give us some nice even density here on this. Now, from here, we can start to delete this back in terms of the number of edges. We could also consider bringing this to a point. Since these are kind of rounded, though, I think I'm going to leave that be. But in this case, I might delete every other edge here to maintain the volume, but give us something a little bit more game-friendly. And then coming down to here, like I mentioned, we can decide if this warrants an edge or not. It really depends on our poly budget for our game and the genre we're working in. So if we're talking about like a PC style game, even a console game, a reasonable budget might be like 15,000 to 30,000 vertices. If you're looking at like a lower end mobile app, you generally want to go as low as possible. And this could be as low as like 5,000 to, or less, honestly, 1,000 to 5,000, depending on the type of game. So it really depends on how many models are going to be on screen, or at least unique models. So just kind of be mindful of that. So with this, I might not necessarily add the ledge. meaning like every little detail. But what I will do is add a lifted transition here. And this will help with the silhouette in terms of the read, kind of give a clear denotion of this getting wider. And then we'll continue this down into the helmet. And this is a good example of the difference between games and film. Is with film, we'd definitely get every little detail on that ledge. In this instance, we can cheat a little bit here with our normal map, kind of capturing this angle while using our polygon volume to get us back into the shape of the silhouette. All right, so now that we have that ledge in place, we can connect this down into the head. And this might be another area where it turns enough right there that we might warrant having a second little edge if we can afford it. What do I mean by afford it? I mean in the polygon budget. Generally speaking, I'll read topology somewhat freely and then check the budget after. That way we have the details. It's a lot easier to subtract than it is to add, generally speaking, and it's a lot easier to tell where you need to subtract from versus where you need to add to. So that's something to kind of be mindful of. It's also easier to calculate how much you need to subtract versus in the process determining whether or not you have enough to add it. And then we'll have this last row come in here and taper in, and that will give us our nice horn shape. You'll notice I also tried to keep this as even as possible in terms of adding edges. That's so you can subtract evenly as well. And that's something we might want to play around with before we move forward, is just making sure we achieve that. Generally, we end up with poles at the end of these for like pointed areas, but our horns are kind of softer and rounded on the helmets. They're not like a blade, so we're not quite getting that. All right, so something like that's going to give me a nice clean result. And that did take a little bit to get to, but it's going to give an excellent result once everything's said and done. So I'm going to save this to kind of keep our progress in check. And what we can do is we can start connecting in the rest of the helmet parts here to finish off our helmet. This is going to be a lot of tabbing to kind of get things in place, and it's going to be quite arbitrary as well. There's not a set amount we need here, which is one of the challenging things when you have a rounded helmet like this. Usually angular things are a lot easier to work with. This is a little bit different. So let's go ahead and just kind of pull these up. And what I try and do is give it a relatively even roundness here, looking for when the plane changes kind of start to occur. Plane changes is when it turns away from the light and starts to look rounded. So the flat areas, you want to let those kind of be carried as much as possible by the polygon. And you're not really looking for even spacing here, but with a rounded surface like this, you tend to get it. So just something to kind of be mindful of. And once again, I'm basically pulling this to where I notice this is about to go tangent. And if we didn't have an edge there, we'd be losing the roundness. And you develop an eye for this over time if it's something you're not already familiar with. So just kind of be mindful of that. The more rounded surfaces you work with, the more you'll get used to this. Also, rounded surfaces in games are really one of the most challenging things to deal with, because you really have to balance budget here in terms of how many polygons you can commit to these rounded areas, and just how rounded you can make it look. Small rounded areas, they tend to not be quite as evil as large ones, so with this helmet kind of being a large feature for the character, we're going to be committing most of our budget to the vertices for this. I am going to try and commit to this all the way down. This is going to kind of set the tempo for the entire topology of the head, so I think getting this established first is going to be helpful. Also, it's kind of the delicate operation area because we're trying to maintain this ledge while also conveying curvature. This is an interesting example of where we can kind of get away with a little bit less curvature from here to here. You'll see it's been relatively even. I don't know if we'll maintain that, but you'll see how that area kind of flattens in the back. That allows us an area of relief and an area to kind of make less dense. Same with here, it kind of comes down straight, so these two areas are going to allow us to have some variance there. Now I can continue this around here as well. Same sort of story with the base of the head. The base of the head is always rounded, so this is basically going to always be a problem. But we can continue our way around here. At some point, I think I either was isolated or wasn't, but now I'm not. So let me go ahead and turn off Make Live here, set these both to object mode again. You can just select them together and then isolate select here. So that way I can work on this bottom area a little bit easier with the quad draw. Now, if you hold tab, it should pull out all of these. So you can see I can actually pull these all out as a chunk. And what I need to do is just kind of adjust the angle and the positioning as I go. But I'm going to do that to try and save myself some time and just keep pulling this out at somewhat even intervals here for the sake of maintaining roundness. And it's just going to be the same process from here, basically using tab, adjusting a little, tab, adjusting a little to get this area. So I'll go ahead and speed through it so you guys don't have to see the full extent. And just remember, it takes time, right? Be patient. Quite often, trying to find solutions that are fast in art doesn't work out. So just be patient with it, and you will get there and get this done. Slow and steady kind of wins the race with retopology. All right, so we're getting to this area where I can connect into this. And I can take a similar approach to what I did here. We can get the necessary edge in, which is this one here, and then we can get in the unnecessary one, which is this triangle here to connect. And then we can just kind of shift connect over into the areas next to it, the adjacent areas. Now, with that said, be mindful of the spacing here. Since I didn't start with the center point, it might just be that I can delete some of these. So, for example, this area probably can be deleted, and then what we can do is we can just readjust based on this placement here to get something a little bit nicer. I don't think we need to readjust everything, but I'll leave that up to you. And what level of perfection you want to operate and execute at here. I do want to be mindful that I don't know if I stayed very consistent with kind of maintaining this on the bevel. I also don't know how consistent the bevel is, but I'm going to try and place it at the center of the bevel here, relatively speaking. And that's because the normal map's going to kind of turn up right here. So I think that'll give us a good result. Okay, so this is going to give us a bulk of the helmet. This is the important stuff, and this is how I like to start my retopology. You get the essential forms first, and then we work ourselves into the filler, and it's because the filler doesn't really matter so much. It's informed by the rest. Now that we have the essential stuff, let's get the filler in here. One of the things I like to do for things like the horns is pull out a radial edge here, coming off of the horn. I do this for ears as well. Any kind of extrusion from the body, I like to add a radial edge. This kind of comes from sub-D modeling for film and just high polys in general. But one of the things I notice is it gives kind of a little buffer here as well. So if we needed to add in a radial edge loop for whatever reason, we have the option to. The other thing is it just lets us have a better read on where things need to connect and how they need to connect, because it's kind of hard coming off of the horn there. It also gives us a smoothing buffer if we do want to come in here and, for example, use Shift to smooth. You can see how when I accidentally nick the horn there, it pulls out of place, but by smoothing here, you know, no issues. So taking a look at this, we can connect these across up here. And basically the trick is to figure out how many of these we can have going that way before we need to switch to these going the other way, right? So can I do one more there, or is that going to be too tight? And then, you know, how many edges do I need to put here to kind of get this connecting down into there and maintain the roundness of the helmet. So I think one there is probably fine. And I think that connects us to the top. Coming down here, you know, I can connect these all the way down to the base already, which is kind of nice. And then we can start to explore connecting these out to other areas of the helmet and, you know, to what extent we're going to need to do that. So We'll always end up with a certain amount going forward and a certain amount going backwards and a certain amount going sideways. So that's something to be aware of. In this instance, I might wait on those and kind of resolve this top area first. As far as these go, it's a matter of just kind of coming back up and connecting into the next area we've created, which will be the central point. And then repeating that process and then kind of figuring out how these are going to interconnect here on a different level. I could also consider not having as many edges being continuous around here. Other things that can be kind of nice too is kind of connecting any radial topology that can be radial, meaning we have a line going around it. For example, here, this is another excellent area where we might want this. And the reason why is this is going to help us kind of find the angles it needs to connect to other things like that horn up there, and just kind of a set direction of where it should go, where it can go, and how these edges will interact. Once again, this does kind of come from the world of sub-D modeling, but I think it is kind of helpful here. And the other reason it can be helpful for game meshes is finding the right spot to resolve things. For example, here, I don't actually need all these edges coming into here. I can resolve those there. And what that does is it kind of acts as the counter shape to these edges, where I'm kind of pulling in, more edges here for that curve, but they're just not needed for the flats. So it gives us a good way to kind of isolate those and contain them. You'll see it's the exact opposite for those, though. They need to radiate outward, so there is some variance there. And be mindful that we can perform reductions at any point needed here, so we're not necessarily going to have this level of density the entire time. We can add triangles where needed, where we can get away with them. So this is kind of an interesting effect here that I wasn't quite anticipating. Notice how that essentially has to jump up into there. We could use something like a triangle at this point, and that will go ahead and allow us to have kind of a redirection. And for those of you who are newer to game art, maybe you're coming from a background in film or you've just had some basic modeling, triangles are your best friend. Triangles are completely allowed in game art. It's not sub-D modeling. We were doing sub-D modeling for the first pass of this when we did the high poly, but now we're not. I'm going to use tab here to pull all these up so you can see we can connect those into there. And I might use shift here to just kind of tidy these up and smooth them out a little bit. And even this base edge here, I might end up getting rid of at some point or kind of merging up with something, but we'll go ahead and give it a little bit of smooth so that it can fill in the space. Just be very careful you don't accidentally do what I did there and get your important edges mixed in. All right, so kind of a similar deal here. I could actually just add in that one edge there if I want to, and then see if this works coming all the way around. And it might not, which is perfectly fine. We could just add in an edge as needed. I'm going to pull this up here and just see where it gets us. We can connect that into there. And in theory, I could connect that into here, but it might be better if I just added a ledge here and we just connect them like so and utilize that top ledge to go into the next area for the helmet. And like I mentioned, we're going to have quite a bit of density in this helmet, but that's okay. That's just part of the process. And for this, I'll just fill in across, and this will give me a good idea of, where I need to connect to what. This is kind of an interesting area here. I'm not exactly sure where I want that to go. If I were to pull this up, it connects into here. The question is, do I want to connect this basically here and have a triangle, or have that come across? And based on the amount of density we have, I think what we'll do is we'll connect it here, and we'll let that come across to another area, because it looks like it's going to need to have a friend over here somewhere to connect into. I probably don't need to smooth this out with shift here. It looks like it's not actually doing anything beneficial at this point, so there's that. All right, so coming into this next area, I have kind of varying density here, so I'm going to pull this up here, and we're going to connect this into this spot here on the visor. And these areas here on the corner of the visor, I'm probably going to bring in a bit more, and we can play around with some of these edges we've added to create the correct relief there. And at this point, these horn ones absolutely need to come down, so we're going to connect those into here. I'm also going to connect that there, and we'll just connect that like so. And I'll continue out over there. I think that'll be fine for that area. Or maybe I won't, because looking at this, we need a few more edges to come up into there. So it's a bit like a puzzle, and you know, with a hard surface object like this, it's not set in stone quite as much as an organic object that needs to move, which is kind of nice. It gives us a bit more flexibility. But I may need to make some changes here. You know, these are going to be coming across. I'm also noticing maybe we need to have more ledges. You know, all of these need to meet up somewhere. So let me go ahead and remove some of the edges up here on the head, so we're not connecting into it right away. And maybe even remove some of the edges here. The only given is pretty much that one. And if I wanted to, I could keep these connected across. So let's continue these back into here. So those connect. And then right now, I basically have one going into several down here. So this is why, you know, we might want to wait to resolve the horn, because the horn can also act as kind of our redirect for these if we're dealing with kind of this radial structure. And we could also consider putting in triangles here. For example, that, you know, connects nicely into there. I could consider removing something like that, but you'll see the volume we lose, so I think that's worth keeping. We could connect that, and I could even just triangular that connection there, and I think that actually works out okay. I don't really want to have this redirect here, though, because I don't feel it's necessary. Where possible, I kind of prefer to use triangles when designing for game stuff. So I'm going to see if maybe I can cheat this in here with a series of triangles. Yeah, I think the other way looks better. All right, we'll just keep it this way for now. So we have that edge loop running down, and we can figure out the reduction later. So that takes care of that backside. So now we need to kind of think about this inside area and whether or not these are going to have enough connections. So I'm going to start with these side ones here because they do need to wrap into the helmet here. And I'm going to need at least one connection from here going up into this area. Like so. So that's going to wrap that up and over. And then we can start to resolve this area. So I have 1, 2, 3 going into 1, 2. That's not going to quite work. We could plan a triangle here and connect those. But I also have 2 going into this area here. So we have to really kind of think about what we're doing. Now we can use various shapes like this to do redirects. And this is very common with areas like a head. So something like that, you know, is going to redirect those over and at that. And we just have to kind of plan our triangles here. I could even, you know, consider deleting some things here as well. I think a triangle would look better there, and something like that will give us an okay result for the helmet. Now, this may not be completely optimal to begin with. There's probably a lot of reduction we can explore and we can do across this. So we do want to be mindful of that and, you know, take it into consideration that we may even do that during the game mesh creation process. But to begin with, we definitely want to give ourselves enough to work with here so that we have a nice, you know, result and something that is clearly going to read correctly once we bring it into a low poly game asset. So let me go ahead and take a look at this. You know, I think that looks okay. We'll go ahead and just do a mesh display soften edge on this because that's ultimately how we're going to bake this. Those corners might be a little bit funky, and also if this is a 90-degree edge, we might have to put a cut there. We're probably going to put a cut there anyway, but should be okay. The last thing I'm going to do here is just kind of create the inner lip for this for now. And remember, we're ultimately going to consider connecting this into the head. So we'll go ahead and just use Make Live, come into our quad draw here, and then do a similar approach to what we just did, kind of creating this interior lip here. And just like before, it's going to use radial topology coming outward and then kind of fill in. So this is kind of just the safe way to give us a ledge. It should mirror the inside relatively closely, surprisingly, but it can be substantially more simplified in the game mesh, which is nice because it's not an area that we're gambling on seeing. So all things to kind of consider. And a great example of that is what I'm doing here taking these little 3-pole areas and reducing them down to a single vertice to get us these nice clear transitions. So we need those round areas for the bake and probably the corner, and those might stay in the game mesh since they affect the silhouette. But on the inside here, it's better if we just have these nice quad shapes coming off of here and allowing us to quickly transition directions. So let's go ahead and just repeat that process here. No fancy stuff's needed here, so in theory you can probably hold tab and try and pull this up. But tab over really large areas like this likes to get a little bit wobbly, especially with symmetry. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll pull up an area like this and then do tab on a smaller area to kind of contain it and then tweak these. Rather than doing the whole ring, yeah, I think I'll just do it manually though. Our symmetry is getting blown up from it. And symmetry is relatively sacred when it comes to game art. We can, however, maybe give ourselves a few gaps here and try and find some sort of way to make this go smoother and faster. Sometimes, though, just manually doing it one by one is your best bet. So with these in place here, we could start connecting down, or we could wait to see how this connects into the body to figure out what's going to be important, what's not. And I think we're going to wait from the looks of it. If we wanted to, though, we could just continue it up. I don't think too many places are going to actually be important with this. And ultimately, because of how this character is, I might keep the helmet separate. The other thing we might do is keep the helmet separate for the sake of animation. If we wanted to do some goofy animations with the helmet, you know, my character doesn't have a face, so it's not like we're going to take it off. But yeah, we might, you know, consider doing something like that. So I'll connect these down here. And, you know, with this scenario, it's pretty easy to kind of connect these. Something that's kind of interesting is I just don't really feel like we need that ledge to have two of these, which is interesting. On this side, I kind of feel like it's okay because there's enough of a width there and it changes angles. Maybe if I do that, that might justify it, but on this side, I feel like we can just combine those two into one and then utilize this as the ledge here for this entire area. I might even go as far as to do that to reduce the number of polygons needed altogether. And then from here, it's kind of just a matter of connecting across and up if we want to have, you know, additional volume. I don't know if I take this all the way with the helmet. We'd need to clear at least the area that the eyes are in if we wanted to make this more usable. For now, let's just leave it here and we'll make that decision down the road. We got the major forms in that are going to matter, and now we have some central volume. With that said, with pretty much all of these, you could do this to greatly reduce the number of vertices needed in terms of this for a game mesh, and I'll even do this for like a low poly mesh, like what we're doing in this initial pass. There's nothing wrong with this in terms of doing kind of an initial reduction. If you have an area on an interior that just is not likely going to be seen, very helpful to just kind of keep the outside triangles and then just reduce those down further inside. And I might even continue that here. You know, if I take a look at this, there's no reason we can't do that here. We may even be able to merge this down somewhere like that. And that's going to be a lot less dense than what we had previously, and also allows us to kind of continue this out if we needed to, and a lot easier because there's so much less going on. This is also something we may end up doing on the exterior of the helmet that I'd like to point out, because the exterior, you know, may not need as many edges as it has. So let's go ahead and leave that there for now. That's going to give us our helmet retopology, and we can go ahead and rename that helm retopo, and we can start working to the rest of the body. Be sure to like and subscribe so you can catch the next video in the series when it goes live.